Hello and welcome back to
Witch and Monk.
Witch and Monk. This is the first time we've recorded in a while. The past couple of weeks have been pretty hectic.
Yeah.
But we've gotten things together. We're back.
Mm-hmm.
And actually today's episode is inspired by the last conversation we had, sort of branching off from that conversation about limiting beliefs and oppression.
Mm-hmm.
In particular, we wanted to talk about rationalization of oppression.
Mm-hmm.
What does that mean?
Mm-hmm.
When we think of oppression as dominance of certain groups and subjecting them to horrible treatment, let's say, inequality, and we think about rationalizing as making things make sense, we're talking about rationalizing oppression as in talking about oppression like it makes sense, the way things work as if it makes sense. And actually, you had written something to start us off that gets at the danger of doing just that.
Well, you know, the way that you conceptualize oppression ultimately is the way that you kind of conceptualize the world and interpret the world and how the world works. And particularly as oppressed peoples, as colonized peoples, it's really important that we don't let the world be interpreted for us.
Yeah.
And colonization forces its version, its own interpretation of the world onto us. And a big part of how it does this is by way of convincing us to rationalize it.
Right.
To rationalize its existence, to rationalize its roots, and all of that. So, this episode, we're going to talk about why that's deceptive and dangerous. And even though that it goes, like, rationalizing it goes very, very unnoticed.
Yeah.
It's kind of easy. It feels very natural. And so we're going to do that with a very specific example.
Yeah.
Yeah. Do you want to talk about the comment?
Well, we got this comment on the last episode.
Yeah. And keep in mind, the last episode, for a little bit of context, was about how our limiting beliefs are rooted in oppression.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And someone said, I hear you guys. I indulge in neuroscience reading, which basically shows how colonialism also comes from these problems that you're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
This need to see the fruits of labor, this creativity hole to fill, this craving for labels and tribes. This stuff came from people, and that's why the revolution begins internally.
Mm-hmm. So, yeah, essentially, it seems this person is sort of arguing that, yes, our limiting beliefs may root in oppression, but also it sort of goes both ways. That also colonization came about because of our human needs and our beliefs. Yeah.
It comes, like, it's a very understandable conclusion to make.
Mm-hmm.
But like we're saying, I would argue that it's kind of a dangerous conclusion. And I know that this person had the best intentions with writing that comment. And I understand why they would see the need to contribute that.
Yeah. And I mean, it's a very typical way that we're sort of taught to think about colonization.
Yeah.
So,
well, humans, they developed over time, and then they decided at some point to feed us, we need to go and do some bad things to other people, etc., etc. I want to challenge y'all. I want us to challenge the audience today by posing a different idea. The idea that, in fact, these are not ideas based on our human needs. Colonization did not come from human needs.
And it didn't emerge, and it's the opposite of natural.
It's the opposite of natural. It really has very little, if anything, to do with what most people, what you and I think and feel and need on a daily basis. Yeah. And to start talking about that, I want to talk about Frantz Fanon, the Manichaean philosopher and psychiatrist, and his book, The Wretched of the Earth. Which I always recommend to people as a great way to think about politics beyond just the US or Canada, beyond just the West, and to think about colonization and the logic of colonized peoples, right? We are both belonging to different peoples that were colonized in countries outside of the United States, and we're the children that were born here. But these things shaped our reality too. Fanon says that the colonial world is a Manichaean world. Now, what does that mean? It's based on the old religion Manichaeanism, which was basically, when it's used in this context, Manichaean will refer to their belief that the world is like a battle between good and evil. Good forces and evil forces, right? And for Fanon, challenging the colonial world, he says, is not a rational confrontation of viewpoints. It's not, I have ideas, you have ideas, let's battle it out.
Yeah.
It's not a discourse on the universal. It's not all universal themes that all of us humans undergo. We're all universally feeling and needing the same things.
Yeah.
But the impassioned claim by the colonized that their world is fundamentally different. The colonial world is a Manichaean world. And so what he says is that for the colonized, really for the colonizer, the colonized are an evil force. That's the first sort of assertion that they make.
Yep.
So think Christopher Columbus, think Hernan Cortez. Once they come to the Americas and they see this opportunity for tremendous wealth, they build this construct of the indigenous peoples in the Americas as being uncivilized, as being barbaric, as being unhygienic, all these kinds of things.
As not knowing how to, take care of what they have, not knowing how to take care of the land, not knowing, they come up with all these
to rationalize these people as subhuman. And these are the same logics that we know to be part of like systemic racism today, right? And so he says that the colonist is not content with stating that the colonized world has lost its values, or worse, never possessed any. The native is declared impervious to ethics, representing not only the absence of values, but also the negation of values. He is, dare we say, the enemy of values. In other words, absolute evil. And so what Fanon says, really importantly, is that it is the colonizer who creates that logic.
Yes.
That the colonized peoples are evil, the enemy of values. And in order for colonization to then change, the colonized have to flip that logic on its head and see it as, no, we are the good. You are the evil. All of these kinds of thought processes, right? They're not natural human thinking. It is not natural. We know this because throughout most of human history, this was not the view. This is something created in recent history to justify, to create the ideas behind colonization and systemic oppression as we know it. It is not natural to see that people with different skin color, people with different culture, with different physical appearance, they're subhuman, as less than you. It's simply not natural.
There's like the concept of race as being a tier, a classification, a tier system of this group of people up here, this in the middle, and this in the last. Like that's not a natural thing.
No, it's simply not a natural thing. And I want to just briefly also touch on Alvaro Reyes, who is this geographer who covers this particular part of Fanon's thinking. He calls it the Manichaean inversion, right? Because you do an inversion to the thinking. And he says that his description outlines the conditions of existence that can account for what will soon follow. It allows us to identify the very structure of the colonial world, its Manichaeanism, as that which will provide the initial impetus for its demise. So the fact that it is based on that thinking, which is so unnatural and so counter to human needs and human flourishing, that is what makes colonization untenable. Not just bad, but untenable, something that's going to self-destruct. And so that is also the only way that we can begin to see oppression for what it is by recognizing that's not me. That's not just something that I would do if I were in their position. That's not natural. That's something completely unnatural and thus unsustainable and thus not only having to end, but ensuring its own end.
Yeah, and I think, like you're saying, this is why it's so dangerous to sort of claim that colonization emerged naturally from our needs. The concept of race, the tier system that is the institution of racism is so much more than just our needs for labeling or our needs for having tribes, having communities, having it is not what that is. No. That's not what racism is. And so when you claim that, you are conceding to the idea that colonization wants you to concede to, that this is just a natural emergence of human history. Right? This is just a natural emergence of like what humans do. in every single sense, colonization and capitalism emerged in opposition to our needs.
Exactly.
So the rationale of colonialism and capitalism is the logics of profit, not the logics of human need.
This actually connects a lot with what we talked about in the last episode when it came to Adam Smith and the idea that humans naturally truck and barter, they naturally exchange. We don't have the anthropological backing for that, right? Similarly, colonialism and capitalism absolutely are not coming from a natural human need. They're coming for the need to create profit, right? If you think about it, profit is a very different thing than meeting your needs.
Yeah.
If you're just having enough food to eat, and that's your need as a being, you're not thinking about how much more food can I stockpile?
How much can I maximize?
How can I maximize the amount of food and the amount of profit I make from the food that I have?
Yeah, that sort of motivation, profit, again, comes in opposition to that need.
Exactly.
And that's what the colonizers did. The colonizers were motivated by their greed to exploit everyone, and separate everyone else from their needs, from the fruits of their labor, because they wanted to hoard all of it.
Yeah.
That's what that was.
Yeah. You were talking about like merchants who were particularly wayward, who had tons of debt, who had poor standing. Christopher Columbus famously goes back to Spain and is outcasted and thrown in prison, right? These are not your average everyday people.
No. And you read In Debt, right, by David Graeber?
Exactly.
About that.
Yeah. Hernan Cortez was in great amounts of debt and died in great debt.
Yeah.
He only had, for one blip of his life, this moment of tremendous success and, forwarding the colonization of the Americas. And that did not last.
Yeah.
And these are things that, emerged from just people being in a specific society, being socialized in a very unnatural way.
Yes.
And continuing to try to protect themselves and to protect their own legacies, their own futures in ways that were completely conducive to destruction, right? So Bengali famine, I wrote down, which is funny because it's like, which Bengali famine are we talking about? But I specifically was referring to also like the 1770 Bengali famine, the Great Bengal famine, which was a period of time in which you're talking about this massive part of the Indian subcontinent that was colonized by a company, which has never happened in human history before. You never had like companies.
East India Trading Company.
Yes, the British company, which had its own army and had built this massive amount of land and exported tons of revenues to its stockholders. This was a whole new way to do colonization, which again itself was only a couple hundred years old. And in this particular case, it was so destructive to the nature that existed in Bengal that famines had happened before in Bengal.
Yes, but this was not a natural famine.
No, it wasn't. It was preventable in numerous ways, and perhaps most importantly, there were several times in which the British could have made different interventions to at least tax the people of Bengal less, to at least ask for less labor from them. And in fact, they put it upward. They taxed them more. They came to people who were literally on like their deathbed by starvation and at gunpoint, asked for them to pay their taxes. This is the kind of thing that we're talking about when we talk about capitalism and colonialism.
British colonizers didn't do that because they needed to.
No. They were trying to answer to stockholders, right? And stockholders are not operating from a position of, I just got to do this so I can eat, pay the bills, get my house. Stockholders are like, how much more profit can I accrue so that I can acquire more and more land? This is a logic that is unique in human history, and it develops specifically, again, from capitalism.
And that's the thing I think a lot of people might misunderstand about, if you want to say the forefathers of colonization. They were not like you. They were not laborers.
No.
They were not laborers looking, to connect with the fruits of their labor. They were wanting to have everybody else labor for them.
Yeah, and this is what's so funny, right? Because to this day, it's like more and more with the proliferation of like hustle culture, grind culture. You have this glorification of this idea of these CEOs who are like, I actually have 3 days in one day.
Yeah.
Or Elon Musk, like, I only get like 2 hours of sleep. Oh, I'm right back to the office after this, right? They're telling these tall tales of themselves as like the most productive people to explain why they have the most, why they are the most successful. Meanwhile, look at how they're paying their workers. Look at what the conditions for work actually are in their companies. Look at what kind of products they're producing. None of this stuff is conducive to like, oh, look at these noble hard workers. But they're doing that to convince us, oh, they're just like me and you. If I would just hustle harder, I'd be like Elon Musk. Obviously, that's not true. So we call this kind of thing the subject position problem. And I think it comes from, again, like an earnest desire that we have to be like, I want to see the good in people. I want to feel like I can relate to different people. So we look at somebody like a Mark Zuckerberg or an Elon Musk or even a Trump, and we say, well, I can get why he would get there. And don't get me wrong, empathy and psychological analysis, these things are good lenses to understand things. But if you do those things correctly, you will see how irrational fundamentally the things that they do are.
Often we will use our own sense of rationality that applies to, our own circumstances, and rationalize actors who are acting on a whole different kind of rationality. The forefathers of colonization and the 1%, like, they have a different set of goals than you do. Completely different. And it's actually completely opposed to your needs. Completely opposed to
your needs. Completely opposed to your existence. It's an opposition to you. And that can seem strange or vulgar to people, to see the world as good and evil, black versus white. And that's why it's so important to bring up Fanon, because the point is, we didn't choose to view the world that way. They did that.
They chose to create that world.
And that ideology. We are just countering it by flipping it on its head. And that's the only way that we can get forward from it. I just think it's funny because we were talking about this and I mentioned, like, somebody saying, well, colonialism comes from like human needs. It comes like you can see why humans did colonialism, because of the way humans think and feel. I just think it's funny because it's like, replace like colonialism, which is this abstract term, with like a specific event. A
specific event within colonialism. Imagine if you just replace that with like the Atlantic slave trade. I can see how humans came up with that to meet their needs. Like, they needed to see the fruits of their labor, and so that's why they created the Atlantic slave trade. And
they just wanted to feel safe. Like, oh, the Holocaust, horrible thing that happened. It's just when humans sometimes are feeling really unsafe, and they're
feeling a lot of fear, this is just what they resort to.
They just kill millions
and millions of people.
That doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make any sense. They don't do these things just out of the same motivations that you and I might steal a loaf of bread from a store if we're poor. That's not the same logic.
It's not the same logic.
When you talk to poor people, a lot of the time they're just kind of like, I don't know, I'm just trying to feed my family, but I don't really want to bother anybody. I want to be kind of left alone. I just think also that maybe this is where we get into housekeeping. This is probably something that might not occur to people of more
white
privilege. White people might not see this as immediately as like people who are not white do. And this is not us trying to be like super identity politics, lib like representation. Like, we're just kind of having to notice, as people who are marginalized backgrounds, people of color, that like we grow up noticing how different worldviews are between different groups of people.
I think white people often can fall into the trap of thinking that politicization is an on and off switch, or using it as like an on and off switch, where some things they'll look at through political lenses and other things it won't occur that it also applies to that too. And so I think because of that, they have to be prompted to look at things from the lens of like race, from the lens of yada yada yada.
Exactly. I find that with something like this there's actually an effort to depoliticize it, right?
Yes.
Like white people sometimes will take it into, so we're talking about something as political as colonialism and its effects on generations.
Yeah.
And a white person will be like, well, yeah, and that does also emerge from human needs. And it's like, wait, you're taking the politics out of it.
Yeah.
Right? We're talking about like our limiting beliefs can emerge from colonialism, because colonialism had this particular effect on my family, which is they're from the Caribbean. They were impoverished. Thinking about queerness when it comes to Latin American families, like these are things that I really live with, and that's why it was so important to say, hey, politics has everything to do with your trauma. It has everything to do with your feeling like you can't do art as a career. It has everything to do with that.
And yeah.
Whereas when you do the inverse and you say, actually, yeah, and also politics has everything to do with your limiting beliefs, what you do is then depoliticize what we're saying.
Yeah.
So instead of it being about, hey, our human needs are affected by politics, you're saying like, well, politics comes out of our human needs. And so our human needs affect our human needs. And that's why it's something we felt the need to address, because white people often can look at everything as a matter of individuality, as a matter of, well, each of us as individuals, we have different perspectives, and that's why we come across different paths to address our needs. So some people choose to do charity, and some people choose to do colonialism, right?
Yeah.
Whereas no, like that's not how we come at it. We grow up noticing the things that we can't get away with versus what white people can get away with. And politicization is one of those things, right? I talk about politics, and I say this a lot, because I see how much it connects with my everyday life. Why my family was rendered completely poor in the Caribbean. Yeah. That's where that comes from. Whereas somebody who, and being specific, like maybe a middle-class white person who lives in Kentucky, or who lives in the Midwest, might not see it as that. They might just see this as like a moral project. They might just see this as like, well, it's politics, you should care about politics because you want to take care of other people, or politics is just like a specific realm of things. But
oftentimes whiteness as an experience doesn't teach you as much about caste as it would BIPOC.
I think you learn from an early age as a person of color, like I can't move a certain way. I can't act a certain way that white people will be able to just like do certain things in school and feel very comfortable with it that I'm not comfortable doing.
Very quickly you learn that like wider society operates differently than you do. It rationalizes very different than you do. And I think for most white people that's not on this, they don't quite have that same realization. Being the dominant culture, and so they're always privy to applying their own rationality to how they see the world, because their own individual rationality. They
never have to think of the outside world as being something antagonistic to them. They can always look at everything as like, well, this is just like just like me, it's like normal, right? And so they can also then be very frustrated or confused when it's like, why are black people always making everything about race? Right? Or why are they always bringing up these ways in which we're different? What about the ways in which we're the same? And it's like, well, because we have to live with the differences. Do you know what I mean? And so I also think that this leads to, sometimes we go on TikTok, not as often as we used to. Sometimes we go on TikTok and we see discourses about queerness, and we see discourses about Sabrina Carpenter, and they go into these rabbit holes about like, what does Sabrina Carpenter as an individual think and feel? What are our human logics and human needs that lead to certain people being certain ways, right? And they miss the material realities in front of them of like who has power and who doesn't, because they're still stuck in everything being like individual mentality,
individually motivated agency, that sort of thing.
When I talked about the Sabrina Carpenter thing on my channel, it was like, I had to prompt white people to think about this from a racial lens, and then they go, oh wow, race, that is interesting. And this can cause then a lack of comprehension on some of these subjects.
And then that can lead to sort of like a derailing and like a hijacking of these conversations.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that makes us kind of want to be a bit more intentional about how we talk with our audience and like how we encourage our audience to respond, because we do love hearing your comments. Doesn't matter if you're white or not, but it kind of does, because we do often find that like YouTube is what it is. A lot of the people who are on here and commenting are white, and a lot of the times the comment section will have white voices kind of dominate it, and so then that can kind of lead to
taking things in a direction that we're already used to thinking about them as.
Right.
We're already sort of taught, like the dominant culture teaches us to think of them as, and with this project we're trying to take things in an alternative direction. And challenging the way that we were taught to think about these things. And so because of that, we really, really want to encourage BIPOC specifically to fill up this comment section, because this space is for you. This is it's predominantly what we really want this space to be about. Far too often spaces get sort of filled up with a lot of white noise, no pun intended. But that can really take the conversation in a different direction. So so we encourage you, if you're a person of color, we want to hear your thoughts. Talk to us about rationalizations of things that occur in society that affect you disproportionately. And is that basically it? It's a shorter episode. Well, thank you for listening and watching, and we will be back soon. We promise. We've got a lot more to talk about. Okay. Bye.